perhaps you're a Christian and you're talking, and out of nowhere, you drop an F bomb. And maybe you get a funny feeling inside, like, should I have said that? Should I not have said that? Who am I around? Do we say that in church? And then you get to wondering, can Christians curse? Should we? And just to make sure we're all on the same level, because I know language has, I don't want to use the word evolved, but it's changed a bit. Curse words, or we call them cuss words, are, probably the 4 and 5 letter words that you're thinking of, right? The F word, the S word, the D word, as we would call them now for those that don't curse. The fun thing about these words is they didn't originate as what we now call curse words. Now, I want to give you 2 examples of a couple words that, some Christians use, some don't, as cuss words. And depending on who you ask, some people will say, yeah, it's okay. They're just words. They only have the power you give them. Other people will say, absolutely not. I would never say that. Wash your mouth out with soap. Well, we don't really do that anymore, but 80s kid here. So I want to start with just a quick history, and you're gonna have to forgive me. The history on these words it's pretty difficult to travel far back to like where they started. So I had to use Google to figure out some of it, right? So we're gonna start with the F word. We know that as, I'm not gonna say it. Yeah, you thought. F-U-C-K. We all know that word, right? People use it as a noun, a verb, an adjective, and on it goes. Nicknames and so forth. So the best that I can tell through history, there was a certain point in time, right around the medieval ages that we can say. I know it's a huge span, but I'm just going to boil it down to you, boil it down for you, because I know this is supposed to be a short video. There was a certain time where population was a very serious thing in certain villages where the people, in order to get permission to have children, had to get the consent of the king. Back then, the word that they used was fornication. Therefore, you would go and apply for a license for the fornication under consent of king. F-U-C-K. Back then, it wasn't a curse word. If you got a license, that was a blessing because you were able to have a child. Nowadays, we use the word in a negative way, right? The other word I want to give you is the S word, the S-H-I-T. There was a certain point where, in history again, where ships were used, to carry a lot of things, cargo, etc. One of the things that they carried was manure from place to place for fertilizer and so forth. They had to stack it a certain way, so you had a ship, and what they used to call it is in transit. And if the things were very high, you had a ship high in transit. Right? And on it goes, right? There's history behind a lot of these different words. The B word itself was just the word for female dog. We don't use that anymore. It's kind of like, you ever read the Old Testament and you're in the book of Numbers and it talks about Balaam's ass, and you're like, oh, it's a cuss word. And that's just the word for donkey. We don't use that word anymore. You're welcome for that. I bet that caught you by surprise. But now we just call him a donkey. So then you're wondering, can I curse? Right? So why don't we look to the Bible? Now, I will say up front that there is not an explicit verse that says thou shalt not cuss, right? Because I think what you really have to do is you have to think through a couple of things about the words themselves. So I want to start off with a verse, and I will admit it may look like I'm cherry picking and taking it out of context, but under further examination, it's not. So you come to Colossians chapter 4 and verse 5-6 says, walk in wisdom, which is living a godly life, toward those who are outside meaning non-Christians, redeeming the time. That I could spend a whole video on that little phrase itself, but he's basically saying that time itself can be used as an opportunity to show people the love of God. Redeeming the time means saving it from the sinfulness that can happen in it and turning it towards God, right? Verse 6, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Each one meaning the people that are outside. Now, you might think, what does that have to do with curse words? So, seasoned with salt. Let's talk about that for a sec. Though we use salt nowadays, to make things taste better, to add flavor, salt itself was a preservative back in those days, and it was used mainly to preserve things like meat. Sometimes they would bury it in salt to make the meat last longer and so forth. So what he's saying there is your speech needs to have grace in it, and it needs to be preserving speech to help somebody. Now, the question I'll ask you, and this may sound subjective, but that's just going to be as the culture, right, as we go along. Is the word a curse word? Can it be a bless word, right? Is your word a curse word, not a bless word? What are bless words? Well, sounds like I'm making that term up, but how you speak to somebody, are you lifting them up? Are you being uplifting, or are you being negative? Are you being aggressive? 9 out of 10 times when people use curse words, it's not always in a good way. Nowadays, I understand that it's very much a part of, just the average speech. But sometimes they come out when we're angry, right? You stub your toe and you let one fly out. Hopefully not in front of your kids, because then you're like, oh, don't say that word. And then you have to explain why you just said a word that you don't want your kids to say. So can we curse? Depends on what the word is. And I'm going to challenge you with something. So if you dig back through history, especially in, in Roman times, by that I mean like during Jesus' time, a little bit after, Jesus Christ was a curse word. Because what it did is it cursed you as a Christian in the Roman people's eyes, right? Christianity was a growing force back in the early first century. So you could say Jesus Christ, and back then it was a cuss word. So I just want you to think about that for a sec. And I will say that if Jesus Christ ever becomes an actual cuss word again, I will cuss like a sailor. I hope that helped you. I know it may seem a bit subjective. Again, there's not an exact verse, but if you ask me, don't use words that society will see as cuss words unless they are actually biblical and in biblical context. And if we can be honest, the F word, there's no biblical context for it. The B word, no biblical context for it, and so forth. Thanks for listening. God bless you.